General Ham, thank you. And, you know, I sit here and I'm incredibly humbled by the folks that are up here with us because they all represent a tremendous amount of knowledge and experience in acquisition and contracting across the board. First, I want to thank General Ham. Thank you again for hosting this key and critical event, so important for the future of our Army, as you clearly defined up front. Dr. Jetty, I think he stepped out, but it's such a pleasure to have such a remarkable military and now industry leader with such a strong career at the helm of ASALT. Miss Hsu, my former boss, great to see you again, always. And your insights are so incredibly important for the future of our Army acquisition and in particular contracting. Again, I'm humbled to be here. This is the A-Team. You have their full bios on the website so you can research them, and I highly encourage you to absolutely do that. But let me first introduce our panel members and quickly go through their bios. Mr. Stu Hazlett. On October 2017, Mr. Stu Hazlett was appointed as the Deputy Assistant Secretary of the Army for Procurement. The DASAP provides executive leadership and supervision of all aspects of the Army's procurement mission. He is responsible for over 270 Army contracting offices worldwide, totaling over 297,000 contract actions and over $74 billion annually. Mr. Hazlett is the functional career representative for contracting and oversees the certification and professional development of over 8,000 military and civilian contracting workforce. He has over 30 years of experience in contracting with the Army, Air Force, and Office of the Secretary of Defense. Mr. Shay Assad is the Director, Defense Pricing and Defense Procurement and Acquisition Policy in OSD, better known as DPAP. He is a career acquisition professional with more than 45 years experience in federal government and commercial business acquisition, with 22 of those years being in private industry. He is responsible for contract pricing and procurement policy matters for 30,000 contracting professionals who spend over $300 billion annually. He serves as the principal advisor to the Undersecretary of Defense for Acquisition and Sustainment on acquisition and procurement negotiation strategies. He is responsible for DOD's procurement regulations as well. Major General Casey Blake is the the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Contracting, Office of the Assistant Secretary of the Air Force for Acquisition. He is responsible for all Air Force contracting. Prior to this assignment, he served as a Commander, Air Force Installation Contracting Agency. General Blake has served as an Information Management Officer, Air Force Mission Director on the NATO Fighter Wing, and Contracts Chief of both an Air Logistics Center and Product Center. He commanded a contracting squadron, served as both a Deputy Mission Support Group Commander and Defense Contract Management Agency Commander, and served as a senior contracting official in OEF, Afghanistan. Mr. Jeff Parsons joined AECOM in November of 2011. He is currently the Executive Vice President for AECOM's Business Operations and Administrative Management Services Group. Jeff provides executive-level leadership and coordination of business infrastructure. Jeff has more than 34 years of distinguished service in contracting and procurement for the U.S. government and industry. A former member of the U.S. Army's Senior Executive Service and a retired Air Force colonel, Jeff held several key command and staff positions with the Air Force and DCMA. In his last position leading Army Contracting Command, Jeff's organization awarded about 20% of all federal contract dollars. And if you've ever seen the movie War Dogs and you want to know the real history with that, I had the pleasure of testifying with Jeff in front of the House Oversight and Government Reform for several hours. So Jeff can tell you the true story there. Major General Kirk Vollmecke is the Program Executive Officer for Intelligence, Electronic Warfare, and Sensors. He is responsible for development, acquisition, and fielding and life cycle support of intelligence, electronic warfare, cyber, and target acquisition programs. He is certified acquisition level 3 in program and contract management. General Vollmecke served as a Deputy Commanding General for the Combined Security Transition Command, Afghanistan, where he oversaw the Security Assistant Program for the Afghan security forces. He has numerous assignments in the Pentagon and Joint Staff and served as the Commanding General of the Mission and Installation Contracting Command and Deputy to the DASA-P. He commanded the Defense Contract Management Agency, Iraq, and Afghanistan, supporting OIF. Ladies and gentlemen, that is your panel. I'll now turn it over to Mr. Stu Hazlett for opening comments.
Thank you, General Phillips, and General Ham, Ms. Hsu, and AUSA. I just want to open up with our summary. I tried to break it out with where is my focus and what am I trying to do to help contribute to making a difference in acquisition reform. And I break it out into 3 different areas. Data. You got to have data if you're going to do the metrics to know whether you're making any improvements or not. I look at talent management, and I look at procurement execution. So in those 3 areas, there's an awful lot of initiatives underway to help contribute to the betterment of that. I think the first thing that I think has made a big difference since we started down a path of acquisition reform 25 years ago with the Federal Acquisition Streamlining Act. You had Section 800 panel. Well, today we have the Section 809 panel that's doing an awful lot of hard work, meaningful work to contribute to the improvement. But what we did not have then was the ability to capture the data, the facts. And what were those facts? We are leading out and we are doing an awful lot of work, and the Undersecretary of the Army should sign out, we hopefully in the next few days or so, to mandate the use of the virtual contracting enterprise, a system that PMs, PEOs, contracting officers, and others can use so that we can capture the facts. We'll be able to know Army requirements lead time. We'll be able to know the procurement administrative lead time up to award. And with that, we can peel it back and answer the questions of why is it taking too long here? Are we out of tolerance? If we can do it at this organization in 92 days, why is it taking us 130 days to buy the same type of commodity here? Why does it take us so long to generate a requirement? That's going to be a big difference in the ways we move out, because if we generate an initiative that we can't implement, that's not going to make a difference in those cycle times, which have gotten out of control, to drive us to quality items, then we probably got the wrong initiative and we need to move on. I put talent management before procurement execution because everything that we do, if you peel it back, you're going to find out what is the competency, the capacity, and the capability of the contracting professionals we have. Out of those 8,000, 1,000 of them being military, 7,000 being civilians, what is our commitment to them to make sure that they have all the tools they need to move out? We don't have an Army-wide talent management program for contracting. So that is one of my commitments, along with James Simpson and the other contracting leaders with Mike Hoskins' assistance. We're going to put in place a talent management program that will take care of the growing and the maturing of these contracting professionals. We want to put the right soldier in the right place in the battlefield to make a difference. And then the last, procurement execution, you heard my boss talk about fixed price incentive firm targets, OTAs, other tools in the toolbox. I let out as my sit rep report to him last Friday. I said, sir, we've obligated approximately $34 billion to date. We have $57 billion to go before the end of September. That's an awful lot of work over the time frame of about 5.5 months. We've yet to get some of our money trickling down yet for us to be able to fund the requirements we have. There will not be any vacations in August and September for contracting professionals, program managers, or many finance people. And we've got to do something to help them take that to the left the best we do. And with help AUSA, I hope we do make a difference in that area. So that's all my opening remarks. Thank you.
Stu, thank you. And Mr. Assad?
Got it. Thank you very much, General. It's a pleasure to be here, General Ham, Ms. Hsu. It's always great to see you. You know, we are trying to do some things that are very different than we've done in the past. And the Army, frankly, is at the spear of trying to do those things differently. I think you're very fortunate to have a guy like Stu Hazlett sitting in the position that he's sitting in. I've known Stu for many years. He worked for me. And he's, you know, he's a great leader, and he'll do a fine job for the United States Army. I do agree with him that we have to get away from the arm waving and finger pointing that Ms. Shu talked about, and get to the data and the facts and work collaboratively as a team. It's extremely important because as we move quickly, and we will move quickly, right? As we do that, we've got to ensure that our PEOs and our program managers are fully informed and that they're making informed decisions. Because a quick decision, an uninformed quick decision, is probably a bad decision, right? And so what we're trying to do is rapidly get the information together so that we can make good decisions. The workforce has come a long way since 2007. The reality of life is that we probably have somewhere between 25 and 30,000 more folks in the acquisition community today than we had 10 years ago. And we have a more well-trained workforce, and we have a more capable workforce. The bathtub that people used to talk about, where they were worried about folks like myself finally agreeing or retiring, and how are we going to fill this bathtub? It's been filled. We have plenty of people in the 3 to 10 year experience time frame, and frankly, those people have been trained better than any component of the workforce in the last 40 years. They've got significant capability. What that means in order to retain those kinds of folks is you have to empower them, and you have to have senior leaders who they believe actually know what they're doing, right? Because they know the rule set. They understand the trade space. So if the senior leaders don't know that rule set or the trade space and they get frustrated by it, that can lead to quick frustration with the workforce. Because to me, acquisition innovation, I had an interesting discussion with some folks in the commercial sector that came to talk to me. And they said, well, what are you going to bring commercial innovation to the workforce within the Department of Defense? So I looked at them and said, well, I've actually run a commercial company. What are you talking about? What innovation are you talking about? And there was dead silence, right? I mean, the reality of life is, in my mind, what innovation is understanding the rule set, the environment that you're in, and then using that rule set to accomplish what our PEOs and program managers want to do. There's almost nothing that we can't do in the Department of Defense with regard to acquisitions. Some require waivers, and it takes courage to stand up and say, well, I guess we're going to waive that. Well, that's okay. That's why the waiver process is in place, right? I mean, we've got to have the ability to understand what we can do. So to me, I'm very excited about what's going on. I hope we get to have a dialogue about some of the things we're doing in the department, because they're very, very different today than even 18 months ago. And I'd like to give you some examples of some tremendous success stories within the Army, who is taking advantage of those new acquisition techniques that we're now starting to use. And those new acquisition techniques are simply world-class professionals being given the trade space that they need and the decision space that they need, and they understand what that space is, and then saying, okay, go get the job done. And I'll give you some great examples of that. Casey?
Thanks, sir. General Ham, thanks for inviting me. Ms. Shu, good to see you again. I am among friends, and I don't say that in any way insincerely or disingenuously. My time in joint assignments with the Army starts back in 2004 when I was deployed to Iraq in support of MNFI. I was a contingency contracting officer supporting the efforts over there. I had the electrical comm and transportation sector. So it's great to be here, and thank you for inviting me. So I do want to start with this. This is sort of a framing assumption for where I think the Air Force is headed. and it's comes right out of Defense Secretary James Mattis's National Defense Strategy. Most of you, I'm assuming, have read at least the unclassified version and potentially the classified version. And there are 11 objectives in that, and number 10 really resonated with me. Let me read it for you. Continuously delivering performance with affordability and speed as we change departmental mindset, culture, and management systems. That, in my view, gives Air Force contracting and really the department contracting all the leverage and the empowerment it needs to make significant changes. So let me just talk just briefly about some of the things that the Air Force is doing. First off, Secretary or our new Senior Acquisition Executive, Dr. Roper, every time we go in and talk to him about something, he said, speed, speed, speed. And he's not talking about speed at the sake of affordability, because we need both. He's talking about speed in the decision cycle. So he has delegated everything that he possibly can to the PEOs. And all the functionals, contracting one of the important functionals, I have delegated. I'm the HCA, single HCA for the Air Force. I have 101 responsibilities. All but 15 of those have been delegated. The 15 have stayed with me because they're really at the agency level and affect the entire enterprise. So he wants to eliminate or minimize drag on the system. Right now, we are tracking 50 million to 500 million non-competitive acquisitions. It's taking us on average about 12 months, just over 12 months to get on contract. We have to do that much faster. Mr. Assad talked about, Mr. Hazlett talked about Section 809 panel. I'm a commissioner, one of 18, along with my buddy over there, General Hoskins. And this first report is 642 pages. There's 24 recommendations. Now you might think, wow, 642 pages, but let me remind you, unlike the other Fair, Fast, and the other reports that have been produced and are stacked somewhere, I really have become less cynical over what we're doing in 809 panel, because the front end of that report is recommendations. The back end of that report is literally legislative proposals. Line in, line out. We're going to give it to Congress and say, look, and this is non-attribution, right? You're part of the problem. We've got to reduce the reporting. We've got to reduce the drag in the system. And so let's clear out all the underbrush that we've got right now. We've got statutes that are in there that have been there for years and are no longer relevant. So that was one of the things. And there's 10 teams. The first report, we addressed a number of different issues, and I'll be more than happy to talk to that in the discussions. Air Force, in the AFARs, we rescinded 20,000 unique clauses. Now, why is that important? Because we don't want folks doing things independently. We need to have some standardization and some streamlining on what we're doing so that we're consistent primarily in our interface with industry. We also looked at software development. We're in the middle of that. Today's technology is dated tomorrow. And so how do we do that in a less sequential manner? Because everything we do is sequentially. So we're actually building the priorities and entering into sprints. And depending on who the software integrator is, it may be a large prime contractor. It might be me as the government. If it's me as the government, then I might use labor hour contracts. I might use time and material contracts, because it gets me a lot more agility and it gets the decision cycle much faster. If it's a prime contractor that's doing the software integration or is the integrator, then I'm going to set up a D contract and I'm going to issue multiple task orders as quickly as possible to address that. And then the other thing I'll talk about quickly is category management. We've got basically 10 procurement domains that we've sectored off. And this category management, right now, we have about $1 billion in cost avoidance and savings. Why is $1 billion important? Because that buys back more capacity, preserves the existing capacity, and helps me invest in more capability. So category management is huge. We actually have created program managers in each one of those areas to basically manage the spend. We've built some analytics in how we spend and what we're spending on. Thank you.
Hi, General Hamm, thanks for inviting me, and General Swan as well. And a lot of these folks in the room here I've worked with in the past, so it's good to be back with Army contracting. So Bill Phillips had a call with us the other day. He said, if you want some slides, maybe a couple slides, but no more than 2. I just don't want you. I want you to talk for 5 minutes. But I do have one slide. Somebody in there in the back, you want to pull that up? So, I thought I had put all of this behind me. And I literally was sitting in my family room one night with a glass of wine, and somebody calls me up and says, Jeff, you're on television. I said, again? And sure enough, I don't know if you've heard of this show called American Greed. This was just on like a couple of months ago. So I had to tell Bill when he said we're going to be on this panel. I said, well, we've been on a panel before. This was before the House Oversight Government Reform Committee, and we were testifying on Chinese ammunition. I know Kathy Condon's out here in the audience somewhere. She remembers those days as well. But so, I thought this would be good to share just to bring back some memories. But I also want to talk a little bit about, why we got there, right? And that's one of my biggest concerns. As I look back, we did a lot of these. I mean, I testified before Wartime Commission, Senate, the House, other panels that were up there, I think, a dozen times. And it was all related to contracting, something that we did or didn't do or could have done better. And I worry at times that we sometimes forget the lessons that we learned. So we need to memorize that. But the other thing is, the reason that Bill and I ended up here was there was a big push when they were having this issue with the ammunition that they wanted to pull the contracting officer up to the hill. They wanted to fire somebody. They wanted to beat somebody up. And, and Bill and I took the stance that you are not bringing our contracting officer up here to berate them. And, in fact, the contracting officer hadn't done anything wrong in this instance. So, but Bill and I, we took the position that, our contracting professionals need top cover. All right, and so part of our job as leaders was to provide that top cover to the contracting officers. Ms. Hsu talked about the inexperience. It's there. I've been in industry 7-8 years. We do about $400 million, $500 million a year with the Army for all variety of services. So I've been on the other side now for 7.5 years, and the inexperience is there. It's getting better, but one of my observations is some of these contracting officers just freeze today because they're worried about being second-guessed, right? So it's easier for them to turn to me and say, well, if you can answer these audit recommendations, then, we'll move off of the position. Well, wait a minute, you're contracting professionals. I don't deal with the auditors in negotiating. I deal with contracting officers. So we've got to start giving the contracting officers top cover, just like Bill and I did back then when we got called to the Hill to testify about a contracting action. So that's one of the things I would recommend. The other thing that impressed me was, as I got asked to do this, I started pulling all the letters or acquisition reform memos or whatever that the Army is publishing. And this one is the Army Directive, and it's initiative number 6, streamlining the contracting process. And I started reading through this, and there's like 15 things in here that Stuart Hazlett is responsible for doing. I went through this list, and I said, I was with the Army almost 8 years, and I don't think I could even get 2 of these done. All of these are going to be done by April and September, so I'm very, very impressed, Stu, that you are going to be able. One of the things I noticed, as you move on and you've been in this business a long time, the people behind you are a lot smarter, right? So, but one of the ones I do want to touch on, because this had to do with protests. I've been involved with a lot of protests. Almost everything we do in AECOM is competitive. We're not a sole source provider, so I've been involved with a lot of source selections. And one of the things that I have been very encouraged with is now the government is starting to realize, especially after the RAND report was put out, was that we need better debriefings, all right? And we're starting to see that. But, I've heard a couple of people, this letter even says that there's frivolous protests out there. And I'll tell you, maybe some companies do. We do not. The Honorable Jedi talked about lawyers. I can tell you at a minimum, it's going to cost me somewhere between $50,000 and $85,000 to decide a protest, right? We don't do those frivolously. If I look over the last 7 years, AECOM's track record with protests, either where we've been defending or have joined with the government, we've had a success rate of 70%. So I wouldn't call those frivolous. So, but I'm very encouraged that the debriefing process is being looked at, and my hat's off to you, Stu. I can't wait to see all these others implemented here by the end of the fiscal year.
Good morning, everybody. Chart up, please. I have one chart. To pace the threat, and I'm deeply focused on this, just given my portfolio, but I think it's applicable to the discussion on act reform, contracting, and everything that members have already talked about. I believe in order to pace the threat, we've got to have agile, adaptable constructs, systems, processes, and the people have to be aligned. I'm going to give you a lot of concrete, positive examples about early stakeholder buy-in, how to tailor your source selection schemes, and to get to the outcomes necessary, because I think that's foundational. I'll give you an example as a PEO. I started in environment measuring. So I had administrative lead times that showed me in 2015 I was taking over 22 months to get on contract, and I had 37 sole source bridge extensions, which are indicative of not getting to effective early planning. I'm an engaged user. We're now down to 12 months average with 4 bridges only. So that's just 2 data points. Let me give you some examples of early stake-in buy. And it goes to the whole heart of DevOps, the principles there in commercial, but we apply that in offensive cyber. I do that in my world of EW, and many of my intel functions and activities. But I'm telling you, it's applicable across the systems acquisition model. And again, it's important that we really get after it. We embrace now demo. You heard Ms. Hsu talk about try, deploy, fly, prove out before you buy. Many of our models and constructs have changed up to get after that for us. So we can get the learning, the refinement of the requirements, and then also recognize speed to commercial and the nature of microelectronics, and all that says we should be focused on small quantity buys, smartly leveraging competition in our path. That's why it must be agile, adaptive acquisition programs to go forward. It may not apply in all the mission areas, but what I can tell you in what I have highlighted on a chart, multi-domain, cross-domain, ground, air, cyberspace, space are connected and converged, and it's about integrated solutions. But we have to get after that. Also talk about, as an engaged customer, it's about accountability. So on those things where I'm pacing threat, time is critical, national security is involved. We also use the use of R&D liquidated damages. I expect companies, and I've had companies sign up, so they know for a day-to-day slip, in some cases it'll cost them greater than $50 million a day for a slip. So that gets back into IMS believability and signing up. I think, again, it gets back to the heart of the source selections. Source selections, I have users engaged in user trials and operational assessments, even ATEC and the test communities, all part of the best value trades and the decisions. And I think having that's critical. We have to get after the contract mechanisms to promote adaptability, not use it as a buzzword, but actually action it, whether it's through use of incentive fee pools, not type contracts, but pools to motivate, but the approaches on the multiple award IDIQs. So back to the bus analogy, the big bus. That day and age is over. We need tailored mission-focused instruments to get after our activities. Dr. Gansler, if you would ask him and go back to studies of years of the past, will tell you the multiple awards were never intended to have the world in them. They were supposed to be balanced and manageable at 4 to 6, not where we're having now dozens on dozens. And then procurements become many source selections that take 2 years to get to a task order award. Got to change that. I'll just offer. In source selections that I offer up, we must make sure primes and subs are motivated. On and off ramp abilities apply so we can refresh best of breed. Likewise, on industry, you need to understand the development environment that we are asking you to come and compete and then potentially be awarded. But again, that embraces the DevOps principles that are out there commercially, but in many of our domains. Now, I'll just offer a final comment, and I've got lots of examples to show tailored and recent successes. So I've awarded a $500 million effort in 5.5 months. I actually went from 0 to requirements, source selection, and everything approved in 86 days. I gave them the goal of 60 days. I gave them pizza, locked them into a room. But it's amazing when you focus as a customer how you can get to your outcomes. One comment, I have 5 ongoing OTA actions under the C5 Consortium OTA. My whole PEO's portfolio is under that. I'm using that, but it's balanced. I'm balancing traditional approaches and new approaches. What I find interesting, and back to industry, your call to action. We need help with qualified proposals. Imagine, in a sole source environment, I have a company that wants 5 months to give me a proposal. I can't wait 5 months. I have needs in theater. But again, OTAs, companies are finding it challenging because it's not just traditional and non-traditional, but this notion of a ROM, a rough order of magnitude, an estimate. It doesn't have to be a precise figure, but again, I find industry also needs to adjust their processes to be equally adaptable and adaptive to the change that the department is asking us and all of us are demanding to get to the outcomes. But I look forward to the questions, and I've got lots of good examples. But again, I believe in agile, adaptive, open, adaptable programs. I think it's necessary to face the threat. Thank you.
Well, thanks again to our panel members. They did a great job. We have about 30 minutes for questions and answers. First question goes to Mr. Hazlett. Please describe some of the skills and attributes that you seek in contracting and acquisition leaders through a revised talent management system.
I don't know. I want him to be a Marvel hero, comic leader, superhero kind of person. I mean, it's a difficult profession. And I think that what makes a great KO, I talk about that all the time. And I say it depends to a certain degree, but they need to have a strong technical foundation. They have to understand the different tools that are in the toolbox. And if they don't, then they're only going to use what they're comfortable with. So I have to take them and expand that. And I know that in some areas, we may not need them to expand certain skill sets and different whatever they may be acquiring, but I need them to have that knowledge because they need to be able to move if we need them to move, and talent management to say you're ready for the next step. You're ready to go into an area you haven't even thought about before. One of the other attributes of a great contracting officer, I think, an acquisition leader is the ability to communicate. Communicate to the point that there's no risk of miscommunication. And knowing that even that is not enough. So we struggle in this day and age of rapid fire email messages that go around the world very quickly that may have been sent at the wrong moment, at the wrong time, didn't count to 10, didn't do that, and then misinterpretation. We struggle with that, but we need contracting officers, though, that are willing to communicate to Kirk Vollmecke, to be able to explain to him from their vantage point, what do they see? PMs being able to communicate what they need. So communication is there, and I take that to the other degree of OTAs. In the Army, we did about 365 OTAs last year for about $1.4 billion. A lot more than any other military department, and we're looking at leaning forward and doing those. We are now putting out there the pause to say, let's ensure that we're doing these for the right reasons, that there aren't other tools we could use. But I've never seen a level that we've created now called an agreements officer. We had contracting officers that may have unlimited warrants, but those contracting officers may not have the attributes to be an agreements officer. To sit there with a blank sheet of paper to know, how do I go all the way from here, to know, as Mr. Assad would teach us in cash flow policy and other aspects of the terms and conditions, you have to know if you're going to get the right product at a fair and reasonable price. And then passion for the profession. You have to know that it's a profession, first of all, and that you need to go get certified. You need to go and get education outside of what the normal workday is. And we're looking at new ways to educate through webinars, but now we're down to vignettes, Snapchats, all kinds of things they just pull off of YouTube and look at their desk to say, just like I was trying to maybe spackle a wall and paint it, I got on YouTube to learn how to do it best. They're looking at how to do a UCA that way. We have to get better, and we have to control that to know, is it got the logo of the Office of DASA P on it, to know that you're just not looking at somebody who did one and may not have done it that well. And then a willingness to change, to adapt. If they're set in their methods and said, this is the way we've always done it, then I probably don't think they're a great contracting officer, and that we need to do a little bit maturing with that individual. So in a nutshell, I'd say those are my basics.
Great insights, Stu. Thank you. Question number 2 goes to Mr. Assad. How do we get to the right negotiated number quicker and in a manner that is fair and reasonable to the government and industry, and any examples you might have?
Yeah, I think the name of the game is transparency, right? And we're having some degree of success, not as much as we would like, with transparency. And what does that mean? It just means that we're both on the same playing field, right? The government and the companies are both on the same playing field. They have the same set of facts, and that they're dealing in an environment where they're now trying to use those facts with their set of skills that they have and negotiate a position that's fair and reasonable. We have a lot of situations where we only get part of the story. And I'll give you a recent example. I won't say the program, but it was a major Army program. It was in excess of $2 billion. And to the Army's credit, they kind of held firm, and this was the negotiating team. This is the talent I'm talking about. They insisted that they get the information. And it wasn't that they needed thousands of pages of information. They just needed the right information, right? I'll give you an example. A major subcontractor, right, who might be working on this program for, let's say, 5 or 6 or 7 years on an annual basis under a firm fixed price. And so the contracting officer said, well, how are they doing? And the company said, well, that's a firm fixed price. And the contracting officer said, what does that have to do with anything? How can you take the position that their actual experience isn't relevant to what it is that they're selling us? And so the company refused to get the data, so the Army just stood there and said, well, when you get us the data, we'll get this done. And, the company made several attempts. They went to ASALT. They went everywhere trying to get to a 4-star. The 4-star threw them out. And basically said, no, we've got a contracting officer. Go deal with her. She knows what she's asking for. So ultimately, the company finally came to provide the information, and they reached a settlement. Now, it was one of those it took a year and a half to get done. But what happened as a result of that? The light clicked on with the company. They realized, you know what, if we could have gotten this done a lot quicker if we simply had been transparent. So what did the Army do? They had a follow-on multi-year contract to negotiate with that company. And they called me, and they said, wait, we think we can use the data we presently have to negotiate the follow-on multi-year right now. So in 3 days, without a proposal, they settled up on the follow-on 5-year multi-year. And that's where we're going. What we're saying to our contracting officers, and it's going to be a huge change for industry, is, look, we want proposals in 30 to 60 days. We presently have major weapon systems that there's one that's 21 months to get a proposal. I don't know how you can do anything quickly if it takes 21 months to get a proposal. So where we're going, what we've asked Congress to allow us to do is to tailor the TINA requirement. And what we want to be able to do is sit down with a company and say, okay, let's talk about whatever it is we're buying. Tell me about the information that you have the actual information or the data that you have, the estimates that you have related to this particular product. And let's agree on that data set as being the cost and pricing data that you're going to have to certify. Because where we want to go is get companies out of the mode of saying, well, I got a $750,000 TINA threshold, or now it's $2 million, and therefore, you know, I've got to go get all this cost or pricing data, and it's going to take me months to do. No, what we're trying to say is, no, we actually want a proposal in 30 to 60 days. It's going to be a huge change set in culture for these companies because they're going to have to take some risk. And they're not used to taking risk. Companies are not, we talk about us being risk averse. The major companies with which we deal are far more risk averse, right? They just, and they have to be to a certain degree. They've got to report their earnings to the penny on a quarterly basis. So I can understand where they're coming from. But we're going to have to work together because we want to radically change the way we're doing business. The TINA threshold change from $750K to $2 million would change 900 days to 885. We want to make 900 days be 60 or be 90. So one of the other things that we're doing is we're telling our contracting officers, okay, we want you to negotiate the instant years by, and if you think you got a pretty good deal, we want you to go negotiate options right then for the follow-on 2 years. And oh, by the way, we want you to put unspecified FMS requirement options in those contracts. And so the Army did that on 2 different programs, the same organization that negotiated a multi-year in 3 days. So it can be done. The tools are there to do it. It takes PEOs and PMs to have confidence in their teams. It takes talented teams, and it takes companies who are willing to take some risk, right? And to Dr. Jetty's comments about FPI, that's what enabled them to do it, right? There was a degree of risk that we were asking the company to take and the government was taking, so we're sharing in that risk. And we're pretty comfortable that the company's going to do just fine, profitability-wise, right? And so what we're trying to do is create an environment that enables companies to move quickly to submit proposals in 30 to 60 days, quality proposals that we can audit. And we're going to commit to them. You submit your proposal in 60 days, we're going to get it audited in 60 days, and we're going to get to the table quickly, right? We can't be asking them to do things in 30 to 60 days and take a year. Can't do it. And so we're changing things very differently. We're running a couple of pilots right now. One of them is with the Army, and several with the Air Force. General Blake is aware of those, and a couple with the Navy and MDA, where we're talking, in one case, a $10 billion procurement, which we think we're going to get done in 120 days. So, you know, we're going to a very different place. But what that means is there has to be much more transparency at both the prime and subcontract level, because the primes only have so much they can control. And what we're saying to our contracting officers is no, you really do have the authority to settle. You really do. And what I'm asking our senior procurement executives to do, our SAEs, when that phone rings from a senior person, to simply say, no, we've got a contracting org. I don't negotiate contracts. You can call him or her. They'll get the deal for you know. They're authorized to negotiate. Whatever they think is fair will be fine with us. And then there needs to be an alignment with the PEO and the program manager and that contracting officer, because ultimately it's the PEO and program manager's program, and they need to be in on the business deal in terms of defining success or frankly failure. Right? If the program is not run well, what does the program manager or PEO think is a reasonable return for that company to make? So we want to bring the PEO and the program manager into that decision-making process so there's complete alignment, so that there's no daylight between that contracting officer and whoever is that senior individual that's involved, so that they in fact can turn a PEO. Nothing is more powerful than a PEO being called and the PEO response being, I have a contracting officer. I understand exactly what they're doing. Get to the table and get it done with them, because that's how we're going to get this done. So I, for one, have seen some remarkable results within the Army. And this has happened in the last 6 to 9 months. So these are not just random examples. They are getting it. Now, like any major buying command, you have some groups of folks who are really talented and are really getting it, and you have others that need a lot more training and a lot more, mentoring. And that's the leadership's responsibility. That's Stu's responsibility. That's General Simpson's responsibility. Make sure that happens. But the fact of the matter is, we're making progress. The Army is making progress. We've got a long way to go. But they're doing things, I think, that the Secretary can be proud of in terms of actually moving with some speed. To General Vollmecke's comments, that to Stu's comments, they now understand the data. There's no more mystery about how long it's taking. And once you understand how long it takes, then you got to say, okay, what do we got to do to change it? And so I'm very personally, I'm very excited that the Army's getting it. And it's going to take a while, but they are getting it. General?
Shay, thanks. Next question goes to our General Blake. It's on the 809 panel. One of the problems with slow processes is the lack of discussion with industry, pre-solicitation. I've seen many RFPs or solicitations canceled during evaluation because industry misses the mark. What are some panel recommendations associated with one-on-one discussions? And a part of this is not industry days or forecast symposiums. Thoughts?
So I don't think that the panel's primarily focused on that aspect as we are on accessing emerging technologies, removing some of the impasses. I think with regard for the one-on-one discussions, certainly the agency can do much better in communicating the requirements. I would say that there probably ought to be another panel stood up to figure out how we synchronize JSIDs, the BBS system, and the information flow from the requiring activity through the acquirer to industry. In fact, I would argue that PBIS, when it was stood up by then Secretary of Defense McNamara, was a good system. We have one primary focus, and that was how do we counter the Soviets. Today, we have two revisionist powers, two superpowers or competitors, and we have a couple of rogue nations that we're dealing with. So we're dealing with asymmetrical threats along the entire spectrum to potential issues in contested space in space. So in order to do that, we have to, as I mentioned earlier, reduce the drag on the system because we really speak in different dialects. So the requiring activity speaks in the JSIDS dialect, the acquirer speaks in the PBIS dialect, and then the contracting officer has to figure out how do I interpret the initial requirement out to industry, and how do I communicate that in a way that they understand what we want. So that's a really hard question to answer specifically, but more holistically, I think we have to look at the entire cycle on how we communicate with industry, because we oftentimes we think we can fix stupid in requirements generation and contract execution, and I'm not that good. I can't do that. But what I can do is help shape and influence the dispositions on how I develop that requirement. And I would, from a contracting standpoint, I want to move left as far as possible to help the requiring activity define that requirement in a way that helps inform industry. Because I think once industry is more informed and we've communicated, and yeah, we do draft RFPs, and we still sometimes miss the mark on that. So I'm not sure that I answered your question, but I think that a more holistic approach ought to be looked at.
Other panel members?
Yeah, if I could just for a second. one-on-one. We can't emphasize, there needs to be more communication with industry during the entire solicitation process. And the issue is, to a certain degree, inexperience and a lack of confidence. And frankly, contracting officers and PEOs and program managers looking at the legal community and say, no, we're going to have this discussion. Right? You're welcome to sit in the room while we talk to this company, but we're going to listen to what their concerns are, and we're going to actually have a discussion with them. And oh, by the way, we're going to offer anybody else who wants to come in and talk to us. Right? There's not enough of that. There needs to be more, to Stuart's point about communication, there just needs to be more communication with the company, because the companies are not going to express their concerns in a public meeting. They're just not going to do it. They're in competition, right? They want to win, and they have legitimate concerns. When I was on the other side of the table, I just wanted the ability to come in and present my company's position. I didn't expect the government to make a decision. Frankly, I didn't even almost expect them to say much, but to at least hear from us in terms of the concerns that we had about the procurement they were conducting. Do you want to say something about that, Jeff? Or Carol?
If I can just add, so I do believe that early engagement is critical. So for us, it is a best practice. We have one-on-ones. So for every major procurement that's related to a program activity, we start with that market research. We start with the early dialogue. Even as we're working the operational requirements through the appropriate service or joint staff level, it goes out for comment, as well as the work scope and the technical requirements, as well as the source selection plan. So we have general sessions, so on distributed common ground station, most recent on CD1. So we had over 270 industry partner members show up. We then went over nearly to 100 one-on-ones. Everybody got the opportunities. We looped it 3 times. Almost all my major procurements, we do both those. And if I can just throw in on an added step as a best practice, back to the dialogue. So once you are into the source selection, I'll tell you another thing that we have to do. To start cutting down the time, we need to make sure if you've got a deficiency in your proposal or a big problem to get your attention, we need to bring you in. We need to lay it down. So this is with the contracting officer and the legal and the program. But again, that face-to-face to get your attention, which is, the hint is, we don't want protracted discussions. Let's get to it. You either solve it or you can't. But again, I believe you have to have the one-on-ones, just as Mr. Assad said, you're right. No one in the room wants to give up their competitive advantage or perceived advantage. We have to have that continuous dialogue. I'll also tell you, at least from a PEO perspective, when market research goes out in RFI, you'll see a proviso that says, please respond because you may actually be excluded from the future. Market research is by design, and now we need to leverage that and really have a healthy dialogue.
Yeah, I'll agree with Shay about the public forums with industry. I mean, I interact a lot with our business development folks, and they are very reluctant in industry forum to bring up, because they do really believe that they may tip their hand on competitive advantage. So more one-on-one with industry, I think, is definitely a good thing. Even again, we do mainly service contracts, and what my concern that I've been watching with a lot of the source selections and the requirements is that they're coming out, they're not real performance-based. My observations, we've moved away from performance-based service acquisition. All right, so now what we're getting is RFPs that dictate what your manning is going to be. Number of people, the types of people, what the ratio of U.S. expats are going to be to local nationals to foreign nationals, how many people will be supervised. And, I know, Stu, that one of the things you're looking to do is get $1 billion out of the service spend. I'm telling you that it's possible, but you got to let industry really understand what the requirement is, and then let us offer some technological solutions to some of the service contracts to get that manpower down. But that's the only way you're going to do it. But if you keep dictating how many people it's going to take to do the job instead of letting industry figure out, okay, how can I meet that outcome? You're not going to achieve that. So more industry discussion on that and RFP preparation would be very valuable too.
Great discussion across the board. I would just offer this. Many years ago, we did a program where we really wanted to shake up the way that we did industry days, and we did JLTV. And one of the things that we did, there were 11 companies that were interested in proposing against JLTV, and we had an industry day, but that wasn't enough because no one raises their hand or does anything in one of those open sessions. So we did one-on-one sessions with 2 4-star generals at the head table, General Corelli and General Dunford, and they chaired the meeting, and we did one-on-one sessions for 4 hours, giving each industry partner up to 30 minutes to come in and share their insights one-on-one. I took 11 pages of notes that day, and as a result of that, we refined the requirements, refined our acquisition strategy, and went forward with a much better program, and I think the results of that speak for itself today. Those, I think, are some of the innovative ideas that the panel is sharing with this team. Jeff, I have another question for you, and this is really from me, from knowing your experience inside the Army for many years working contracting and also the Air Force and where you sit today. You've had a lot of experience with services. And when Ms. Shue and I were working services, we thought that maybe 30% of the Army was contracting for services. The actual number ended up being about 67% or 70%. What should the Army or all the services be doing today to do service contracts better?
Well, so I'll just reemphasize. I think that we need to really get back and look at performance-based, and best value, right? We keep telling them, oh yeah, this is the best value source selection, but I can tell you what's happening in the process through the discussion process, the fact that the solicitations really aren't performance-based. The fact that the solicitations really aren't performance-based, you start getting technical leveling, all right? And so then at the end of the day, it's going to come down to price. And I can just tell you that what you're seeing out there is a lot of companies are getting very creative in their accounting and in their pricing in order to drive that price as low as possible. Some of the proposals we put in, when I take a look at the fee that we're proposing, it's so low that I know if we're going to have a major technical issue or performance issue, we'll wipe out the profit, right? So we're, my opinion, we're on the brink on these service contracts. While we keep saying it's not LPTA, we're still driving that price down too low. I think the Air Force, we've seen this on the AFCAP contract where, the Air Force has had some stumbles with some of the task orders awarding that because the contractors are not able to execute and do that transition at the prices that they're proposing. So I think that's another area that we've really got to take a look at.
Other panel members?
I'd like to, I don't disagree with what Jeff is saying about we are taking some what we consider performance work statements or performance-based statements, and they're becoming something else. And it's there again. We're driving possibly the wrong behavior. Jeff mentioned that we're trying to take out of our budget about $1.2 billion out of our POM in 2024, and that is going to have to come out of a lot of services. And when we drive back to our installations, one of the easiest things to do for a program manager and a contracting officer is to sit there and say, how do we save money without decreasing or descoping the requirement? And you go right to the FTEs. And you say, okay, let me tell them how many FTEs there are. And that's the wrong approach. And we are taking that on, James and I and others are taking that on to ensure that we're going back to more performance-based requirements so that the contractors can tell us how best to solve that. I think one of the other things that we talked about, and Casey mentioned it, category management. Something that we all started doing in the federal government. All the military departments started doing category management some years ago. I applaud the Air Force. They took it to the next level. They took it to the next step, whereas he alluded to creating these mega program managers or category managers that's overseeing the services requirements quite from even the planning, programming, and budgeting, you would say, of that particular service. We are taking that on in the Army. OSD has challenged us to say, can we adopt what the Air Force has done and move it over to the Army? And as we're doing it, we're doing the classical, well, how is the Air Force doing it? How would we be able to get there? And what are those differences that we need to change? And we're working that diligently so that we can take on category management to know it's more than just the instant contract. And one other area in services that we are taking on is we're always preoccupied with the award. Did we get this right? Did we get this right? And then we ignore the administration of that. And I think someone mentioned earlier about the importance of our contracting officer representatives and the role that they play in the next few years of administering that contract. And I think we are going to take on that transition as we think acquisition reform. We're thinking administration of those services.
Could I say something, Bill?
Sure.
You know, in terms of how we spend our money and what we contract for, the reality of life is everybody likes to be associated with the major programs, right? It's the sexy thing to do. It's the fun thing to do. It's notoriety. But the reality is we only spend about 25 to 30% of our money on those programs on an annual basis. So 70% of our money is being spent for services contracting and to sustain and support the rest of our fleet, right? Our battlefield requirements. So, you know, focusing on that 70% becomes incredibly important. I, for one, I've never been, I am not now a fan of fixed price services contracts. Right? I've never been a fan of them. And, you know, it's my belief that when you try to, and Jeff is right on the money, when you don't have a meaningful performance work statement that's been thought out, and in those environments, when you do have it, you've got to give the company the trade space to go figure out how can I most effectively do this. I think what may be happening is that people are beginning to realize that they really don't know their requirement from a performance-based point of view. And so they've learned that they get into these performance-based contracts that are usually fixed price, and they've got change, right? And they've got things that aren't quite what they wanted to have. I mean, frankly, we don't want to put a company in a position where if they stumble once in performance, they're going to lose all their profit. I mean, because they're going to get a different kind of behavior. You just are. It's just the reality of life. So I think we need to step back from this a little bit and say, are we really using the right contract types for some of this work? You know, where are we much better off in some cases when we don't have a performance basis established to simply say, look, I want this level of effort because I'm not quite sure what my performance requirement's going to be, and therefore I'm going to do that on a cost plus fixed fee basis. It's going to cost us a lot less money to do that. It's going to give the companies good cash flow. It's going to assure that they get some kind of a fee if they perform in some representative way. On the other hand, if we have a performance work statement and we understand it, fixed price performance-based contracting is perfectly appropriate. So where I'm going is we got to kind of open the aperture up. We see the Navy is kind of on the cost type side of this street. The Air Force is on the fixed price side of this street. The Army is both ways, frankly, right? And that might be the right solution. I'm just saying that we just need to step back a little bit and use the historical information that we have and say, look, are we doing the right things here? And in those situations where we can properly define a performance work statement, I couldn't agree more with Jeff. You've got to give the companies the opportunity to use their technical expertise to come up with the best solution.
General Blake?
Yeah, sir, thanks. So one of the things that I think, to Mr. Parsons' point, getting away from the performance specifications or PWS to a task frequency, that's not a good solution for the Air Force anyway. And it all goes back to doing an adequate risk assessment. Because when you do an adequate risk assessment, it shapes your requirement better, and it shapes it in a way that it better informs industry. I don't know how we're going to get past low price technically acceptable. Look, on the best value spectrum, it is considered best value. But one thing I think we're negligent on is the FAR Part 9 responsibility determinations that we have to tie into that. I really think that when the Air Force is spending about 60% of its budget on services, that we have to get after it. One of the ways that we are getting after it is through large strategic sourcing, requirements creation, and contract structures. And then we're putting contractors on a share line to see how well they're doing, because we can get a better assessment on the performance on that contract when we understand what the share line looks like.
If I could just say one thing about best value. The reality is, the challenge is that if you have a multiplicity of companies coming in, and one of the things that we are stressing, we're stressing the Army, Navy, and the Air Force in this regard, is saying, look, you got to be able to value. What premium are you willing to pay? If you're not willing to pay a premium for performance, then you're not willing to pay a premium. But if you are, then you shouldn't have a problem telling the companies, look, these are the things I value, and if I can get objective performance versus threshold performance, I'm willing to pay a premium of X. Because all too often we want to make this a mysterious environment where no one really understands. I can't tell you the number of times that we have said that price or technical is significantly more important than cost, and yet a company comes in and they lose by what appears to them a trivial amount of money. Right? They say, well, wait, I thought you said this was best value and that you valued these things. Well, it turned out we really didn't. And we need to be fair to these companies. They need to understand the playing field and how to win. And that's really all most want. They want to be treated equally, and they want to know how to win. And they understand that they don't always win. Where they go off the track is when they think you've told them you're going to do it one way, and the ultimate competitive environment is very different. And they say, hey, wait a minute, I thought you were going to do a best value procurement, and you said technical performance was significantly more important than price, and I lost by 0.5%. How's that work? Right? And I was all blue, and he was acceptable. On the other hand, if you're in a situation where General Blake says, look, I've got 9 companies. Any one of the 9 can do this work. And really all I want them to do is do the work. I really don't have a means to value effort above that. Then it kind of makes sense, right? LPTA makes sense in that environment. But it should not be the default mechanism. It ought to be an assessment of, can I monetize the value proposition and communicate it to industry so they understand, how do I win this competition?
General Vollmecke?
I just offer, gets back to, Stu, you opened up with the categories. And again, I appreciate the dialogue on best value trade-off. From a PEO perspective, it revolves around the systems engineering, technical advisory, assistance support, CEDA, as we call. We elusively say everything is best value trade-off. The reality is, first, it goes back to the requirements. We don't ask cogently performance-based. Actually, the policy was written in 1995. We still have never yet hit our stride or been able to achieve the original policy that's still out there on the internet. Pull it down, look at it. I would argue from a PEO perspective, and back to the categories and back to the broad spends, we should not prescribe the work content and make it vanilla across the board. It needs to be mission tailored. So in many of my areas and domains, I need seasoned, experienced folks. Well, then I need to say so, because I don't need someone out of college that may have had a systems engineering course, but actually has never touched anything hard out of the NSA. So again, as an example, we've got to get performance-based. But I tell you, it's time for commission. It's time to get back, because we've lost the art of being able to write our requirements. So as a PEO, I champion that. And I believe, and I tell my PMs, you own that requirement. And I'm not talking about the operational. I'm talking about the requirement to get to a spec package to go out so a company can make a decision whether or not they want to bid on it or make an offer on it. That's the part we've lost. We've lost our ability to cogently, concisely, precisely write down what it is we want. And I would just, that's fair opportunity, but please don't mandate, again, cross all services, one single approach to writing the requirements. You've missed it, because I'll tell you, I use machine learning algorithms. I go out there and use what's out in the commercial world for many of my program activities. So I go to the finance world, I go to Wall Street, I look at their deep, adaptive machine learning algorithms. I see the petabytes in the hours that they get. So there are approaches, but it gets back to what I've offered up. We've got to allow industry to bring in the experience, the tools, the analytical tools, and propose that all as a package, even in the world of CETA. Right now, it's because the behavior. We're told to report contractor FTEs. So that behavior drives us other than best value trade-off. We have to report the eaches as opposed to allowing for flexibility, adaptability, and smartness to play out.
Kurt, thank you. And we've got about 3 minutes left, 30 seconds or less for closing comments. First, General Vollmecke.
I believe we're in an age of agile, adaptive. It is not new, but it's only in partnership with our industry. And again, we talked about proposals. Mr. Assad laid out a lot of departmental initiatives, and I think that's important to embrace. But I do think we are in an age, it isn't new, to maximize COTS and NDI. I'd ask you to look at the new guidebooks that are out there, embrace where we're going with market research and early user engagement, as well as the partnership with industry. There are lots of opportunities to go to left and then bring the execution to the left as a whole.
Mr. Parsons? Oh, sorry.
Sorry.
Mr. Parsons?
Yeah, thanks, Bill. So I'll just go back and reflect on what I said in my opening comments. I think that we've seen a lot over the years in contracting, good things and bad things, but we really need to remember the lessons that we experienced and learn from those. And I had one breakfast with General Pete Corelli on my last day with the Army, and he asked me what my biggest concern when I was leaving, and I said, you know what? My biggest concern is that even though the Army's got wonderful lessons learned and we do all these staff rise 5 years from now, a lot of what we did and why we stood up Army Contracting Command is going to be forgotten, and that concerns me. So.
Jeff, thanks. General Blake?
Thank you, sir. So I would just say this. We're always talking about speed, and Secretary Mattis talks about speed of relevance. It's not how fast I get technology to the warfighter. It's how quickly I integrate that technology across multiple domains and platforms. Then I would tell you that the Air Force has got to think big, start small, fail quickly, or succeed quickly. So scale, really, really important. And contracting's right in the middle of making it happen. With what Dr. Jetty pointed out in terms of margin, I am not, or the Air Force is not opposed to contractors making margin. I am opposed to a 13.5% margin on a requirement that delivers at $75 million and I settle at $100 million. I'd much rather pay 13.5% on $80 million. Do the math. That's where I'm at.
Casey, thank you. Mr. Assad?
Yeah, I think the Army has come a long way here. We are, it's a large community. There are a lot of different commands. They buy a lot of different things. I like to say that we buy nuclear-powered aircraft carriers, JLTV, and we buy cucumbers, right? So it takes a lot of different experience, right? We need to move quickly, and Ms. Hsu hit it right on the head. This is a team sport. If we don't have complete alignment from our PEOs, program managers, and contracting communities, we will fail. We will fail. And so I think I, for one, am very excited about a lot of the change that's occurring. I kind of ground myself back in the acquisition initiatives that David Packett put out in 1971, and I think if you looked at a lot of the things we're talking about today, the Packett Commission came to the same conclusion. The difference is you got to be willing to actually take the action to change, right, to make it happen.
Shay, thank you, and thank you for being part of the panel. General Ham, I'd like to just offer my thanks to AUSA once again for allowing this panel to occur, and thank all our great panel members for all their comments today. And I turn it over to Mr. Stu Hazlett for final comments.
Thank you again, General Ham, and for the panel. If I had to sum it up, I mean, the topics that we talked about here today and the questions we answered, some of them are in the margins, and they are challenges today that we're going to tackle and we're going to overcome and we're going to get there. But we can't forget what we want to do in the long term, and it comes down to a workforce, a competent workforce that has confidence, and confident workforces then will drive smart contracting. And we've got to keep our focus on that, and I challenge you, even with the industry partners, that it's also your workforce too that needs to keep growing and maturing as we keep moving forward. But thank you.
And would you join me in a round of applause for this great panel? Thanks.